Millions of people cheered when a man was shot to death on a New York sidewalk. Not because they knew him, not because they had a grievance against him personally, because he ran a health insurance company. Something in that response, something raw and collective and almost biological, told us more about the state of the human condition today than any think piece or policy paper published in the last decade. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. Across decades in business, athletics, and art, my life circumstances have led me to question and look deeper into my own beliefs as well as those of others. What I want to explore today is the void, not as a metaphor, not as a spiritual abstraction, but a structural wound that is being actively exploited by every major institution in the modern economy, and why filling that void is not a self-help project. It is, in the most literal sense, the prerequisite for everything else. Your satisfaction, your ability to love and give and contribute, and your ability to resist being stripped of your power by systems that were never built to care whether you lived or died. By the end, you'll understand three things. First, what the void actually is, where it comes from, and why it makes you predictable to people who profit from your insufficiency. Second, why the systems promising to solve your most human problems at scale are structurally incapable of delivering what they promise, and why that gap between promise and delivery is not a glitch. It is the design. And third, where wholeness actually comes from, and why the answer begins somewhere so immediate that most people walk past it every day. There is a piece of this that connects the applause for a CEO's murder to something much older and much more personal than politics. And it runs through a 1996 film about a community theater and two of the most celebrated actors in American history. I'll get to that. But first, let me start with what the void actually is. The void is not depression. It's not sadness. It is not dissatisfaction with your circumstances. The void is chronic internal experience of being not quite enough, a feeling that who you are as you currently stand is insufficient until something external arrives to confirm it. It is the experience of the empty seat in the front row. You know, the one. You built the whole show around it. And if you're honest with yourself, you've been building it your whole life. Developmental psychology is clear about where this begins in early life. The experience of being seen specifically, accurately, and warmly by the people who matter most to you is the foundational condition for building what researchers call a secure sense of self. When that experience is absent or inconsistent, you grow up with a structural vacancy at the center of your identity. It's not a flaw. It's not a failure. A wound produced by conditions you had no control over. And that wound does not stay invisible. It shows up in the data. A researcher named Sandra Matz spent years mapping what your digital behavior reveals about your inner life, your search history, your purchase patterns, the hours you reach for your phone, and what you reach for when you do. She found that, well, what she found is that the gap between who you perform yourself to be and who you actually are is consistently legible in that data, whether you want it to be or not. Facebook had an internal document, a confirmed offering, an internal document that confirmed that they were offering advertisers the ability to do target marketing to teenagers and the ability to target teenagers at precisely the moments of emotional insecurity. Not despite the vulnerability, but because of it. The void is not a problem the economy is trying to solve. The void is an inventory item. Your insufficiency, measured in behavioral residue, is sold to the highest bidder before you finish your morning coffee. A 1973 economist named E.F. Schumacher wrote that every artificial need the modern economy generates, every product that promises to make you more admired, more secure, more loved, increases your dependence on an outside force that you cannot control. And that dependence is not incidental to the system, it's the system's engine. The person who experiences themselves as whole generates less economic activity than the person who doesn't. So the architecture has a direct financial interest in keeping you reaching. Here's where it gets personal, and where I want to bring in something that surprised me when I sat with it long enough to see what it actually was saying. In 1996, Christopher Guest made a film called Waiting for Guffman. It follows a small Missouri town staging a musical to celebrate its 150th anniversary. The director invites a famous Broadway producer named Mort Guffman to attend opening night. And from that single invitation, something fundamental shifts. Not the show itself, which was already good, but the meaning the cast assigns to the show. They began pouring everything they have into a production that was already complete for an audience that was already there in order to impress a single person none of them had ever met. Opening night, Guffman's seat is empty. He never came. The audience loves the show. And still, the cast experiences something close to collapse because the meaning of what they created had been entirely outsourced to someone who never showed up. That film is not a satire of small town naivete. It is a precise psychological portrait of what the void does to creative work, to human ambition, to the experience of being alive. The Blaine Missouri cast, and Guffman did not need Guffman to produce a good show. They needed him to tell them it was good. And that distinction between making something real and needing someone important to confirm it exists is the operational definition of the void. Now stay with me, because this is where it gets even a little bit more complicated than it may first appear. In 1973, Marlon Brando won Best Actor for The Godfather. He sent a woman to the stage to decline the award on his behalf, using the moment to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. The audience split between booing and applause. The gesture was real. The intention was genuine. And yet, here's the thing I keep returning to. Brando could only make that move because the system had already crowned him. The refusal requires the desire of everyone else in the room in order to work. You cannot make a statement by walking away from an Oscar unless the Oscar still means everything to the people watching you walk away. The power of the gesture is borrowed from the hunger of the crowd. Sean Penn this year won Best Actor, Supporting Actor, and he was not at the ceremony. He was in the Ukraine. He previously had handed one of his Oscars to the president of that country as a gesture of solidarity. The man had already given away 2 Oscars. Well, that is the most expensive act of protest in the history of protest. And it is also, in its structure, the same paradox. Penn is not outside the system. He is using the system's own gravitational field as leverage. The empty chair he leaves at the ceremony is meaningful precisely because every other person in that room still needs to be in it. But here's what most people miss about this. Brando and Penn, for all the integrity of their gestures, are not a model that most people can follow. You cannot refuse an Oscar you were never offered. The Blaine, Missouri cast cannot make Guffman's absence into a statement. they can only experience it as a loss. And the billions of people navigating insurance claims through automated systems, reaching for their phones at 2 a.m., reaching or measuring their worth in metrics that they didn't choose, they're not in Brando's position. They're in Corky St. Clair's position back in the movie, waiting, hoping, building, hoping the seat fills. What Brando and Penn did share, and this is where the genuine contrast lives, is an interior life that existed prior to the award. Brando's early work in theater, his training under Stella Adler, his years of developing a relationship to his own instrument that had nothing to do with Hollywood's opinion of it. Well, that was the foundation. Penn's commitment to causes larger than his career, his physical presence in conflict zones, his willingness to be somewhere unglamorous and unwitnessed when the cameras weren't rolling. That was the foundation. The gesture of the ceremony was the surface expression of something that had already been built in private, in small conditions, in relationships to actual human beings rather than to a platform or an industry or an audience of millions. The contrast with Guffman's cast is not that Brando and Penn were more talented or more disciplined. It's that they had developed a relationship to their own sufficiency that the award could not grant, and the empty chair could not destroy. They found something that doesn't scale and can't be targeted by behavioral advertising, that the system cannot measure because it doesn't live in the behavioral residue. And that something is the answer to the void. Now, I want to bring this back to the street in New York because the connection is exact, and I don't want it to get lost. The people who applauded that death were not endorsing violence. What they were expressing viscerally in their bodies in the most immediate and unfiltered way was the accumulated experience of navigating a system that had perfected the art of scaling ideology while eliminating care. Think about what it actually means to call an insurance company when you're sick. You navigate an automated system designed to exhaust you before you reach a human being. You reach a representative reading from a script in a language of policy and procedure. You explain your situation, your actual human situation, the one involving your body, your family, your fear, your vulnerability. And you're met with protocol, not a person, a protocol wearing a person's voice. The denial comes not from cruelty, but from something almost worse than cruelty. It comes from indifference that has been systematized. The care that was scaled out of the transaction long before your call connected. Schumacher wrote that people can only be fully themselves in small, comprehensible groups, that the human scale is where identity forms, where work carries meaning, where the feedback loop between what you do and what it produces runs through relationships you can see and trust. What the insurance system represents, what so much of the global economy represents at this moment, is the complete inversion of that. The ideology scales. The care does not. The millions of people who felt something when they read that headline were feeling the exact tension Schumacher described 50 years ago. The tension between the structure that is built for volume and the human being who needed something, someone on the other end of the line who actually gave a damn. That is why wholeness is not a luxury. That is why I want to name it directly as I can. The only condition under which a human being can resist systemic exploitation is the condition of not needing what the system is selling. A person who has developed a genuine interior life, who experiences themselves as sufficient before the metrics arrive, before the notifications count, before the reviews come in, is a profoundly less exploitable person than the one who has not. The void that advertisers monetize, the platforms measure, the global economy runs on, that void cannot be exploited in a person who has genuinely addressed it. And the addressing of it cannot happen at scale. Research from Penn, Penn, America found that one-on-one conversations with trusted local messengers changed actual behavior in 89% of participants in context where large-scale campaigns had failed entirely. The mechanism is not complicated. When a person feels genuinely seen and known, their nervous system responds differently than it does to a broadcast. This is not sentiment. This is a biology operating at the scale it was designed for. Now, this channel began as a resource for people navigating complex PTSD, but Transcendent is for anyone human who faces pain or transformation at various points in life. Sometimes that pain is obvious. Sometimes it's unseen until the very end of life. But what matters is the journey away from outdated patterns toward a spirit that cannot be duplicated by artificial intelligence or healed through force. That's what we explore here. The work of becoming whole is not the work of acquiring something you don't have. It's the work of recognizing something that was already there but was systemically obscured, first by early experiences that left the front row seat empty, then by a global economy that discovered the seat was empty and built an entire industry around keeping it that way. Brando found his way to sufficiency in a studio in New York before Hollywood knew his name. Penn found his way to it on a road in a war zone where no one was counting his likes. Neither path is available to most people as described. But the principle inside both of them is available to everyone. The decision to build something real in a small, honest place for people who are actually present before the important seat is filled. The Blaine, Missouri cast show, Guffman, it was already a good show. Their audience already loved it. The only thing that gave Guffman's empty chair power over them was their inability in that moment to be sufficient witness to their own work. That capacity is what every system in the modern economy is designed to prevent you from developing. And it is the one thing that none of them can take from you once you have it. If you want to explore this further, the architecture of wholeness, the psychology of sufficiency, the gap between what scales and what's actually human, my work and more than 20 books are available at roachcreative.com. These ideas run through everything I've written because they've run through everything I've lived. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. Wishing you all the best.